You are listening to Preconceived, where we examine the preconceptions that shape how we view the world and the paradigms by which we live our lives.
Hey everybody, I'm Zale and Nadine, and welcome to another episode of Preconceived. The term cancel culture refers to the increasingly popular practice of condemning someone, often a public figure, or canceling them for something they have said or something they have done that is considered offensive. You can be canceled for a variety of transgressions on a whole spectrum of severity. When one is canceled, support is largely withdrawn over social media, and hateful comments about the person in question often follow en masse. Beyond a sunken reputation, the canceled party is often fired from their job and blacklisted from the industry in which they worked. On July 7th of this year, a letter cautioning the dangers of cancel culture was published in Harper's magazine and signed by 150 international public figures, including authors J.K. Rowling and Margaret Atwood, and many distinguished thought leaders, including Malcolm Gladwell, Noam Chomsky, and highly regarded professors and educational leaders. The letter was entitled, "A Letter on Justice and Open Debate." Here's a brief excerpt. Well, it's not so brief, but here's an excerpt. The free exchange of information and ideas, the lifeblood of a liberal society, is daily becoming more constricted. While we have come to expect this on the radical right, censoriousness is also spreading more widely in our culture. An intolerance of opposing views, a vogue for public shaming and ostracism, and a tendency to dissolve complex policy issues in a blinding moral certainty. We uphold the value of robust and even caustic counterspeech from all quarters, but it is now all too common to hear calls for swift and severe retribution in response to perceived transgressions of speech and thought. More troubling still, institutional leaders, in a spirit of panicked damage control, are delivering hasty and disproportionate punishments instead of considered reforms. Editors are fired for running controversial pieces. Books are withdrawn for alleged inauthenticity. Journalists are barred from writing on certain topics. Professors are investigated for quoting works of literature in class. A researcher is fired for circulating a peer-reviewed academic study. And the heads of organizations are ousted for what are sometimes just clumsy mistakes. Whatever the arguments around each particular incident, the result has been to steadily narrow the boundaries of what can be said without the threat of reprisal. We are already paying the price in greater risk of aversion among writers, artists, and journalists who fear for their livelihoods if they depart from the consensus or even lack sufficient zeal in agreement. I am so honored to be joined today by one of the 150 people who signed this document, Professor Nadine Strossen. Nadine, a chaired professor at New York Law School and the immediate past president of the American Civil Liberties Union from 1991 to 2008, is a leading expert and frequent speaker and media commentator on constitutional law and civil liberties, who has testified before Congress on multiple occasions. The National Law Journal has named Strossen one of America's 100 most influential lawyers, and several other national publications have named her one of the country's most influential women. Strossen's 2018 book, Hate: Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship, has earned praise from ideologically diverse experts. Washington University selected Hate as its 2019 Common Read. Her earlier book, Defending Pornography, Free Speech, Sex, and the Fight for Women's Rights, was named a New York Times Notable Book of 1995. Nadine, very accomplished. Not that you need me to tell you that.
Zale, I'm so honored to be on your podcast, and speak of accomplishment, to be both a podcaster and an ophthalmologist. That's a wonderful combination. But if I may start by saying aloud what I wrote to you in an email,
Sure.
I think that it is a perfect combination, because ophthalmology, of course, you are improving the vision of your fortunate patients. And I'm very grateful to my own ophthalmologist, because I've had many vision problems, so I understand what a transformative effect you can have and do have on people's literal vision. But your preconceived podcast, the idea of getting people to confront and take a second look at their preconceptions. You're talking about vision in the metaphorical sense as well, and increasing people's vision in the sense of understanding, comprehension, beliefs, values. And I shared with you what I'd like to share with your listeners. One of my favorite quotes from one of my heroes, Helen Keller, a wonderful human rights activist and a really fascinating, interesting woman. Among her many accomplishments, she was a founding member of the American Civil Liberties Union, the organization I was proud to head for many years. And when somebody once asked her, she of course famously lost her sight at an early age, when somebody asked her, is there anything you can imagine that's worse than losing your sight? And her answer was yes, losing your vision. So thank you for protecting vision in both senses of the word.
That is so poetic, and I love that quote. And thank you so much for the kind words. You touched on the theme of the podcast, preconceived. And in many ways, the goal of this podcast is to understand why we think the way that we do and to actually explore issues, not just accept them because that's what we are supposed to think, but because we want to get to the root of why we think certain things, and in some cases change the way we think. And this episode is on cancel culture, and it has the unintended effect of limiting that conversation because we're now expected in many senses to conform to the most progressive opinion, and any questioning of that is, for certain topics, discouraged and frowned upon. And even when picking which episodes I do, sometimes I find myself veering away from some of the more controversial episodes because it feels like you're not allowed to talk about certain topics if you're even questioning or trying to understand the more progressive side of the argument, as opposed to just accepting it and pledging full support.
And I let me chime in there, Zale, because as strong an advocate as I am of freedom of speech, you pick your words, whether you're giving a lecture in a course, as I do as a professor, or whether you're speaking to a public audience, as I often do, or on a podcast, as you and I are both doing. You always have to make a strategic judgment, decision about what message to frame and how most effectively to frame it. After all, if people are not going to listen because they just think the whole topic is illegitimate, you haven't accomplished anything at all. So I just want to assure you that, of course, you should take into account the question of whether you're going to so alienate a potential audience by even addressing a certain subject that there's no point to doing it. And that's the pernicious power of this social pressure, right? It can effectively silence discussions of entire ideas. I myself, I will tell you, there are certain things that I just will not say, even though I believe that I have a free speech right to do so. I believe that I should be able to do so, but I recognize the reality that if I do so, I will completely lose any opportunity of making any persuasive headway with important segments of the audience that I want to reach. So it's a strategic communications decision.
I think some people in this era of cancel culture have maybe run into problems because they've missed that point.
And in the United States, we like to use a phrase, I'm not sure how much it resonates across the border in Canada, but the phrase, a delicate balance. It's constantly used with respect to the issues that arise under the United States Constitution, and I'm familiar enough with Canada's Constitution to know that you have similar issues about limits on government power, the extent of individual rights, which are serious but not absolute, checks and balances between different branches of government, and there is no clear objective answer to these kinds of questions, and that's true in this area as well, right? Because when people are engaging in self-censorship because they don't want to be attacked by the Twitter mobs, that itself is an exercise of free speech. When people decide not to say something because they don't want to offend somebody to whom they're speaking, that is itself an exercise of free speech, right? Because freedom of speech includes the power to frame our message in a certain way, including decisions about what not to say, as well as what to say. But at what point is it not really you're exercising your own genuine freedom of choice about what to say and what not to say when you are so intimidated and reasonably fearful that if you say what you want to, you will be subject to enormously adverse consequences from mobs descending upon you through social media and ostracizing you and stigmatizing you, to even losing not only your job, but as you say, even potentially your livelihood, because you're blackballed in effect.
So Nadine, what made you sign this letter? I think the message is very important. What made you want to be part of this?
All of the reasons that you and I have already talked about, really seeing the downside of the current manifestation, very strong manifestation of cancel culture. But I had in mind a particular group of people that I was trying to protect by signing that letter. And that group of people was not myself and the other 152 signers. By definition, we felt secure enough, or maybe we were foolhardy enough, that we risked putting our names on a letter that immediately became controversial and subject to denunciations, which is fine, right? We're welcoming criticism and discussion, although there was at least one attempt, ironically, to cancel one of the signers. There was an attempt to get him ousted from his job, so that went too far. But putting that aside, as a professor and as somebody who's constantly speaking on the campus lecture circuit, I was writing this letter out of concern for my students and students everywhere, and younger people or people who are not so well established in their careers yet, that they don't have the luxury of making statements such as the one that was made in that letter, or making statements that are likely to expose them to controversy. And I know that they cannot realize the potential benefits of an education or of life as a citizen, a member of a democratic republic in either of our countries, unless they are able to candidly, sensitively, right? If you can express the same idea in a way that's not insulting, then do it. But not to self-censor the idea, not to engage in questioning, not to engage in discussion and debate. That will hamper your entire life, no matter what your particular profession is. It will hamper your social life in terms of your ability to meet and interact with different people who have different ideas, which is so enriching. And it will hamper not only your participation in democratic self-government, but it will really undermine democratic self-government itself. So I was writing on behalf of all of those others.
The idea that you talk there about representing students is so central to the whole debate here, because it is about learning. And I think when we limit the conversation and we say this conversation is something we're not going to talk about because it's too controversial and you just need to agree with the progressive viewpoint, when you do that too much, then you start just accepting things, and it leads to this consciousness where you have these views, but you don't fully understand why you have the views, because there's no room for that debate. And I hadn't considered what you'd said, that basically the people who signed this letter had the comfort of knowing that for the most part, it was going to be pretty difficult for them to get canceled, because you're amongst a pretty distinguished group. You're a distinguished professor, and it would be tough for society to come down on 152 people with such esteem and cancel them. But most people, including students, including myself, don't have that luxury, because if we say the wrong thing, we don't have that credibility to rebound.
Zale, when you talk about yourself, I have no idea how old you are and how long you've been practicing ophthalmology. So I'll picture you as
I'm
a great
32.
You're young. You're young. But, I have been horrified. I have encountered two people, which means that there are zillions more, who just happened to tell me that, one was from the perspective of the medical professional, and the other was from the perspective of a patient, that the patients saying, even if they had long-time established professional relations, that if they discovered that their doctor had voted for Trump or was going to vote for him or supported him or said anything positive about him, that they would no longer use the medical services of that professional. I was absolutely horrified by that. But is that something that has occurred to you, that you might lose certain patients if your views became known?
I haven't experienced that. It's certainly something I'm conscious about when I'm doing episodes. And there are certain things that I have decided not to talk about because I'm aware that it could offend people, especially in this climate. But you remind me that when I went for an interview for my fellowship program to the States, I was interviewing the day after Trump was elected. And the fellowship preceptor actually said to me, if you're a Trump supporter, that's a problem. I'm being serious. Don't apply for this program because we will not get along. It's fine, but I remember thinking that's kind of, and this
But it's not fine, right? That is just not fine. The organization that I headed for so many years, and I'm still on its advisory council, ACLU, we famously, or for some people, infamously defend all fundamental freedoms for all people, which is what the constitutions of both of our countries do as well. No matter who you are, no matter what you believe, you are entitled to certain fundamental freedoms. And the reason why the ACLU zealously defends fundamental rights, even for people who use those rights, freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, to work against civil liberties and civil rights that we crusade for. So we notoriously defended free speech for the Unite the Right demonstrators in Charlottesville and for neo-Nazis in Skokie. And, we're out there counter-demonstrating. But we understand what is absolutely undeniable if you look at history and the present record, which is that if government exercises power to suppress speech solely because it's hated or hateful, or if cancel culture can get away with doing that, that power is going to turn around and bite you, even if it is not being used at the moment. If at the moment it is being used to suppress ideas that are uncongenial to you, take no comfort in that, because if there is not a principled, neutral defense of individual rights to make up your own mind about these important issues, to support an unpopular candidate, then no freedom is safe for any group.
A lot of this conversation relates to a lot of the work you've done throughout your whole life. You wrote the book in 2018, Hate, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech Instead of Censorship. And you talk about that while censorship of hateful opinions might seem like the logical strategy to reduce hate, it can actually achieve the opposite. So let's take one of the more extreme examples of hate, that being the suppression of a neo-Nazi's right to spread his or her hate messages, for example. So you argue, as the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, that suppression of a neo-Nazi's messages is actually a bad thing. Obviously, you're not a supporter of neo-Nazis. Obviously, that goes without saying. But why is it so important, as you argue in your book, that we should not be preventing people from saying things even if we view them as hateful?
I would say especially if we view them as hateful. And because then it is especially important to have that idea out in the open so that we can understand it, so that we can try to persuade or somehow they wean the speaker and advocate of that idea away from it. We'd never have any chance of doing that if we simply use the cudgel of censorship. And there have been very, very impressive documented examples of even leaders of hate-monger organizations being, to use the term they use, redeemed from their views, which, by the way, are usually not a matter of ideology to start with, but these are people who have various kinds of psychological and social problems, and they're looking for some kind of bonding experience. And there's a whole rich literature now, written, some of them memoirs by what they call themselves former hate mongers, some from the perspective of those who engaged with them to wean them away. So we lose that opportunity on an individual level. On a more general level, we use the opportunity to understand their ideas well enough to effectively refute them. As you were saying earlier, Zale, and as every law student and lawyer knows, you can't possibly make the most effective argument of your own unless you fully understand and are even able to articulate the perspectives of your opponents. Those of us who had the great educational benefit of competitive debate as students, why is it that you're required to switch sides from one event to the next? Because that is the way that you best hone the arguments for either side. Going back to, if I may, to an earlier point when you were saying, making this point that you can't refine your own understanding, you can't really appreciate your values unless you understand the challenges to them. I think there's a deeper point here. I think that if you are only indoctrinated with a single point of view, you don't really believe it in any meaningful sense, right? It's like
Absolutely.
reciting in our country the Pledge of Allegiance. And that's why in the wake of the horrible murder of George Floyd and the, I think largely positive, peaceful, constructive protests and renewed movement for racial justice and criminal justice in my country and around the world for that matter, a number of academic institutions, including my own New York Law School, are instituting mandatory educational units on racial justice. And I feel extremely strongly that there has to be academic freedom and free speech and diverse reading materials, because if this is just taught as, here is the program and you have to subscribe to these principles and you have to accept every single platform of Black Lives Matter, it's just going to be lip service on the part of students who do have questions, who do have skepticism, not about the fundamental goals. I really do think everybody at some level is, with very few exceptions, committed to some concept of equal human dignity and equal rights and opportunities before the law. But there can still be very serious disagreements about what is the most effective way to promote those ideals. There are many huge concerns, according to public opinion polls, about how the police function and unjustified use of force and militarization, but very strong disagreements about what is the most effective way to remediate these problems. You can be against defunding the police without being a racist, right? But, we're afraid that in this climate, students won't feel free to articulate that, and that means that their questions are going unanswered, and it may actually make them resent the whole movement for racial justice and criminal justice if they see it as some kind of doctrinaire set of principles that they absolutely must subscribe to.
That's the perfect example. You are categorized as a racist if you don't say 100% defund the police. And if you start addressing the nuances of what that means, for some people, they'll say, wait, are you not behind defund the police? And that's the furthest from where you're at. You're just trying to look at the issue and actually understand it, as opposed to just hop on the bandwagon and say what's popular in the news.
In the United States, there was at least one example of, I believe it was a professor, either a professor or a journalist, who was attacked as a racist for quoting a Black expert who opposed defunding the police. And there's a lot that's been written in the United States, and there was a big article, for example, in the New York Times on early in August, focusing on New York City and African American members of Congress from New York City and local African American community leaders and political leaders who are having huge debates and disagreements among themselves, with a lot of evidence that the vast majority of actual African American citizens who are living in these communities want more police presence in the sense of crime control. Of course, everybody's against unjustified force, but that defunding the police is just going to make them more prey to gang violence, and that's not going to improve their lives markedly, to say the least. If a white person says that, especially, you are going to be called a racist for raising it.
And on the medium of Twitter, where there's a very short word count limit to what you can actually say, of course, there is no room for that nuance to be expressed. So the tagline becomes, excuse the pun, but very black or white. It's very categorical when it's expressed that way. And when people jump on the bandwagon and like a Twitter response, their responses are also limited to, yeah. You can't have an actual discourse and discussion.
So one of the points that's really, really important here before we get even further into this fascinating conversation, Zale, I want to stress, which is that those people who are engaging in all of the conduct that you and I are criticizing, which is unfairly and unwarrantedly calling somebody some kind of an ist or some kind of an obe, as one of my friends put it.
I like that.
That is itself an exercise of free speech. And I wholeheartedly defend their free speech right to do that. I wholeheartedly defend their free speech right to advocate that a different concept of racism from the one that I have. I wholeheartedly advocate their right to ask your boss to fire you, or to ask other people to pile on and not socialize with you. But I am urging people not to exercise their free speech rights in such an abusive, canceling, shaming way. Just the way I urge people not to exercise their right to use insulting epithets or to say something that's insensitive. If we want to promote what is often called a culture of free expression, as distinguished from a cancel culture. Now, a culture of free expression goes beyond just freedom of speech as a legal right, because that is actually extremely secure in the United States and also very secure in Canada. But you, as a real practical matter of your lived experience, you don't actually enjoy real freedom of speech when you are afraid of cancel culture, as you and I have been discussing. So what we need to generate instead is a free speech culture where people consciously restrain their free speech rights in order to promote a culture where people are not intimidated or afraid of candidly expressing their views, even if those views are unpopular.
A lot of your work in hate and the book that you wrote really intersects with cancel culture in an interesting way, because the scope of what hate speech is has now grown to include so much that there's very little that isn't considered controversial to talk about.
Well, basically, it is a term that is used for any expression of any idea that the person using the term hates or considers to be repugnant or wrong for any reason, including political reasons. And the unfairness of that subjective standard, which is infinitely manipulable and evolving and capacious, the unfairness is expanded by the fact that today's view of what is the right, let's say, progressive perspective, although parenthetical, we see a lot of this going on from the other end of the political spectrum too. Maybe since you and I are liberals, we're more concerned about, for now, about that aspect of cancel culture, but I can give you some examples from the other end too. But that to compound that problem, we're now using 2020 hindsight to go back and condemn people for things they said, expression they engaged in at times when it was completely accepted. Now, of course, it's wonderful that we strip the blinders from our eyes, and hopefully every generation is going to have more insight in a more robust and inclusive concept of human rights and equality and dignity. That's wonderful. That's the kind of progress we should hope for. But it's unfair to judge people by an earlier day's standards. You know, we've had a couple examples in the U.S. recently of professors, I believe even African-American professors, but put that aside, who were teaching or even just citing the name of a very famous book by James Baldwin, who we would now say is a great African-American, or Black with a capital B is the appropriate terminology today, right? In his day, in Baldwin's day, the mid-20th century, the respected term for African Americans was Negro. And so he has a very famous work with the word Negro in the title. And professors have been condemned as racist for quoting the title of his book. And James Baldwin, a fabulous writer and crusader for equal justice and racial justice. So this is in my profession, the law, we call this an ex post facto punishment, which is inherently illegal and unconstitutional, against the rule of law. You can't punish somebody for doing something that at the time was not considered to be wrong. You can't use today's standards to punish yesterday's deeds.
Even in more controversial examples, I will say, people are being called out for things they did years ago. Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, there was an image last year that came out of him doing blackface from the early 2000s. Blackface is wrong. I'll be honest with you. I didn't know why blackface was wrong and the history of it. And that's my fault. That is on some level ignorant of me, that I hadn't realized that until more recent years. But obviously Justin Trudeau, he's held to a high standard because he's the Prime Minister. Having said that, I don't think a lot of people knew why blackface is such a big deal and why historically that is something that is frowned upon. Yet it was a massive scandal that ensued in Canada. And if that had come out today in this climate, I wouldn't be surprised if he'd been forced to resign. This is something that he did over 15 years ago, not with malintent probably. This was just a reflection of him being ignorant, most likely, 15 years ago. And then that's coming back to haunt him and to experience a degree of cancel culture.
This has happened in the United States, where politicians and other public figures have definitely had various degrees of punitive, retrospective punishment meted out for what I think in most cases was an ignorant exercise. And I will align myself completely with you, Zale. I did not know the historic background and that this should be seen as insulting rather than, arguably when you dress up as somebody the way kids do in our country for Halloween, for example, you pick somebody you admire, right? So kids would go around with masks of Barack Obama or Michelle Obama. That was not to mock them. That was to desire to be like them. I want to grow up and be like him. Ironically, but it's not really ironic, one of the reasons why I'm so against censorship is that we lose the opportunity to understand, as you yourself said. I would not have understood the negative implications of blackface until or unless there were these instances of people engaging in it. Likewise, with the Confederate monuments in the United States, I didn't know the history that these were not put up right after the Civil War, but instead that they were monuments to Jim Crow, unless we had had these debates about that issue. So you can really even an expression that is itself, by today's standard, against racial justice can actually reinforce people's understanding of and commitment to racial justice through the process of education and discussion and debate.
I want to bring up a few examples that have been prominent in the media over the past few months that represent what cancel culture is about. I want to talk about Drew Brees, who's the quarterback for the New Orleans Saints. And I'm going to explain to the audience some of the comments that were made and what happened for those who aren't familiar with it. So he's a popular quarterback. He's been in the league for about 20 years, pretty well-regarded figure. So he made the comments when asked about players kneeling during the national anthem as a form of protest against racial injustice and police brutality. He said, quote, "I will never agree with anybody disrespecting the flag of the United States of America or our country." And he said, "Let me just tell what I see or what I feel when the national anthem is played and when I look at the flag of the United States. I envision my two grandfathers who fought for this country during World War II, one in the Army and one in the Marine Corps, both risking their lives to protect our country and to try to make our country and this world a better place. So every time I stand with my hand over my heart looking at the flag and singing the national anthem, that's what I think about." Now, that caused a lot of uproar because it didn't account for the negative experiences that people have had with the flag and with America and with racial injustice. Now, within 24 hours, I believe, after a lot of public backlash, Drew Brees comes and he makes a statement very quickly saying, "I support people's right to kneel and understand that kneeling was, quote, never about the flag." For those who don't follow the NFL or didn't know, there has been this issue where one quarterback, Colin Kaepernick, several years ago started kneeling in the national anthem, and he basically was blacklisted from the NFL. No players really are kneeling in the NFL because it's not considered acceptable. But within the week, multiple NFL players were coming out saying, "I'll be kneeling during the national anthem." And that felt inauthentic to me because you've had this opinion that you're not going to kneel for 3-4 years. I'm not sure what the time was. And now suddenly you're coming out saying, "I fully have changed my opinion." And I understand the pressure that these public figures face, but I would rather people come out and say, "I want to learn about this issue. I hadn't looked at it from that perspective before.
Yeah.
I need to consider that. I need to do some research and do some learning and have some chats about this," as opposed to just saying what they're just saying for their perception.
It reminds me of, a politician who holds a finger up to see which way the wind is blowing and then will change opinions just to suit the whatever the current majority opinion is. And you kind of lose respect for people who are doing that. And in terms of, and I say that without knowing the full details of the situation, so I don't mean to say anything condemnatory of the
and I'm not even
involved.
bashing Drew Brees because I understand the pressure he was under, but
exactly, and you made that very clear. As for Colin Kaepernick, I was shocked at the extent of the negative backlash that was unleashed upon him in this country. And one example was Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who's the darling of liberals, and I have the greatest respect and admiration for her myself. And she's usually quite mild in her expression, so I was really surprised that she was doing some TV interview, and she made a very strong condemnation of Colin Kaepernick. So even well-intentioned, well-respected liberals just several years ago, as you say, were condemning his taking the knee as unpatriotic, and Donald Trump, of course, threatened some kind of punishment. So I really respect his courage. He clearly went against the grain, and as you say, he did get canceled for expressing that position. But going back to the flag and Drew Brees, I understand where he's coming from. In this country, there is such fervent patriotism invested in the U.S. flag that when the United States Supreme Court back in 1989 upheld under the First Amendment freedom of speech the right to burn the flag in political protest, there was an enormous eruption and outcry and immediate, completely across the political spectrum, an immediate rush to actually amend our Constitution to make one exception to our free speech guarantee for flag burning. So, I mean, you have to look at Bree's statement in this context, right? Who knows what was in his mind, but I think what his initial statement to me is completely consistent with, this is what it means to me, and that's why I choose to stand, but it means something else to Colin Kaepernick, and that's why he chooses to kneel. And we should both respect each other's perspectives, which are not inconsistent with each other, right? Your family might not have fought in those wars, or if they did, it was unjust because they were fighting for rights abroad that they couldn't exercise here. I understand that it means something different to you.
A lot of people would say maybe there should be tighter legislation on hate speech. And your stance, like you explained before, is no, especially for those examples, we need to be able to have that. We can then react how we'd like to. But if we limit that ability, then that is ultimately going to be counterproductive.
Yes, and this really should go without saying, but I really have to say it. I absolutely deplore any kind of discrimination against anybody for whatever reason.
But it goes without, you're right, it goes without saying, and I'm glad you're saying that, but you're right, I guess it doesn't go without saying in these times.
And I think the reason why cancel culture has become so empowered with all of our technological bangs and whistles is that anything any of us says can be taken completely out of context and blown up around the universe, right? Even if I say, I do not defend the idea that he is advocating, but I defend his right to say it, that can be cut and pasted to make it look like I'm defending the message of a Nazi.
Things are taken out of context so easily. Chris D'Elia is somebody who's been in the news lately. There were sexual allegations that came out about him where he had sent some messages to someone, sexual messages, didn't realize they were 17, but once he realized they were 17, he said, okay, I'm out of here. I don't know the full details of it, but that's an example where it was cut and pasted and only the first part of it was expressed to the public for a while where it looked like he was hitting on a 17-year-old and it omitted the fact that he once realized, oh, wow, you're underage, I'm out of here. So it's almost like...
May I give an example that was really so embarrassing to me because it shows that I was overly trusting something that was widely reported in the media and did not do my own research. And one of the reasons why now I just feel I have to do it. I can't, at most I'll say I read it somewhere. I haven't had time to check it out. But during the last presidential campaign in the United States, when Hillary Clinton made that notorious statement about Trump being supported by a basket of deplorables. Remember that soundbite? And that was repeated over and over again. And I thought, and then so she was constantly bashed for being so elitist and so dismissive of middle class, Midwestern Americans. And somewhere, I can't even remember where, I recently read the overall context, the paragraph in which that statement was made, and it was so taken out of context. She expressed the greatest compassion and concern for the economic problems, the drug problems, the health problems, how these people feel ignored, and they are being ignored. My jaw is just dropping as I repeat this now, Zale. So, shame on me and shame on all the, major media that misreported that. We simply have to, and it's so easy to do our own research these days, right? Just a click of the mouse.
I'm curious your thoughts as a lawyer. It's almost the opposite of the law. You're kind of guilty until proven innocent now.
Oh, it's true.
And if a comment's made without really any evidence, everybody assumes, okay, bad person, you're canceled. And then days later in a smaller story, the actual evidence will come out, which sometimes these people deserve to be canceled. I'm not talking about Harvey Weinstein here, who did deplorable things and illegal things.
As you allude to, that's always been a problem when a newspaper makes a misstatement and then the correction or the retraction, and never receives nearly the amount of attention or circulation as the initial report. So, and I think in fairness, despite the fact that as a legal matter, you're innocent until proven guilty, most people think, well, they wouldn't have charged you unless you were guilty, right? And they may not even remember that you're ultimately acquitted. They remember that you were charged. So it's as with everything, and you and I have alluded that these are all very old problems, but they're just magnified and amplified by the technological power of the internet and other technical marvels today.
So, Nadine, there's one last example I want to bring up, which I found particularly interesting. So J.K. Rowling, she signed the letter that you were a part of. And on June 6th, she was involved in what became a controversy, a big controversy. She tweeted out, "People who menstruate. I'm sure there used to be a word for those people. Someone help me out. Women, wimpin, women." Yeah, I don't think that was necessarily articulated or phrased as sensitively as it could have been to get her point across. But after a bunch of backlash for people saying she was anti-trans, she didn't back down, and she said, "If sex isn't real, there's no same-sex attraction. If sex isn't real, the lived reality of women globally is erased. I know and love trans people, but erasing the concept of sex removes the ability of many to meaningfully discuss their lives. It isn't hate to speak the truth," she tweeted. "The idea that women like me who've been empathetic to trans people for decades, feeling kinship because they're vulnerable in the same way as women, i.e. to male violence, the idea that we hate trans people because they think sex is real and has lived consequences is nonsense." And then she continued, "I respect every trans person's rights to live any way that feels authentic and comfortable to them. I'd march with you if you were discriminated against on the basis of being trans. At the same time, my life has been shaped by being female. I don't believe it's hateful to say so." And what came out afterwards is that she had a history of sexual abuse, and she was worried that anybody could claim they were trans and then go into a women's washroom, for example, and then commit sexual abuse. And that obviously was lost in all of this. I think this is an important topic, transgender, because it's one that I think needs more conversation, because it's not a new concept. There have been people who have been transgender for many, many years, but it's something that people aren't as familiar with. But there isn't room for a conversation. And I'm glad we're doing an episode on transgenders in a couple of months. But it's one of those things that's so taboo that if you even bring up the arguments that J.K. Rowling is discussing here, that's considered anti-trans, even though she's saying here that I would march alongside trans people. I have no issue with trans people. She's considered anti-trans. And
it's an example of why the word hate is being abused. It's used to assault anybody who disagrees about any parameter or detail or causal factor or implication of the situation without at all hating the people that are being talked about, indeed consistent with loving and embracing them and championing their equal rights and equal human dignity, as she does. You know, I have some feminist friends who are very concerned, and there have been debates at women's colleges in the United States. You know, we created this college to be a specific haven for women, and, you know, looking at the historic discrimination against women. What are the implications of changing that? I couldn't agree with you more that these are serious issues that are to be conducted completely consistently with loving and embracing and fighting for the full human rights of trans people, and also loving and embracing and arguing for full recognition of sex and or gender and or whatever any other demographic, biological pigeonholes we're going to come up with.
As you alluded to earlier, imagine if J.K. Rowling's tweet had sparked just a good debate where people had a discussion about what it means to be trans, what is the difference between gender and sex, topics that people, I think, don't actually fully understand, but to some degree feel they need to pretend they understand because it's a topic that you just need to say, I completely am pro-trans.
No, I don't
part
think
of me
people
is
can pretend to understand, Zale. I think people just want to mouth the party line that will stop them from being attacked. I think it shuts off an attempt at understanding.
Well, Nadine, I think we've covered a lot of ground. Thank you so much for spending this time with me and addressing an issue that's so important, because in this effort to reduce hate speech, I think cancel culture has really led to this culture of hate, where people pile on negative comments on Twitter and kick people when they're already down and have lost their careers and livelihoods. And if we can try to have more open conversations, more dialogues, and less admonishment, then that is so important. And I applaud you, not that you need my humble applause, for signing that letter, which I think was really important and adds a lot to the cultural debate. So thank you so much for spending this much time with me and for joining Preconceived.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Zale. All best wishes for your podcast and your surgery.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for listening to another episode of Preconceived. Please, if you are enjoying this podcast, please take the time to go to Apple Podcast and rate the podcast 5 stars and leave a review telling us how we can make these episodes as good as possible for you. Thanks so much and have a great day.
Thank you for listening to Preconceived. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcast or whatever podcast platform you use, and be sure to rate and review us. We'll see you next time.